an honor to do so. I'm a teacher at Oxnard High School. I've been in the public school classrooms of the Oxnard Plains since 1996, and it's been a public high school ride and junior high school ride. And I came across Richard in 2012 after I had been teaching a long time and I just turned 40, and I just discovered this man with a great big heart and just a wellspring of wisdom and knowledge, and just a person who's enhanced my life in a lot of ways. Richard is someone who walks the talk. He has done things for people that most of us will never know, that are significant and profound. He's renewed the spirit of countless men that I personally know, and I'm just much better for knowing him. His topic today is not an easy topic to get people to come out and hear about on a July Saturday afternoon. That's something to break through, because Richard refers to him and people that he knows, and I hope this is okay to share, and Tom, of course, as sacred outlaws and sacred spiritual outlaws. And they have brought their work to so many men. Tom McGee is a man who I know because of my time with Richard starting in 2012. Tom McGee has done many, many retreats with Richard. Tom lives in Oxnard and his practices in Ventura. And Tom has been someone who has been an amazing person to so many people I know. In fact, my dear karate brother Jay, who I've known for 20-some years, has been with Tom in his Ventura, doing his work in Ventura with Tom, and it's had a profound and positive impact. So I'm so glad to be here, and I'm so glad to see all of you. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Richard Palmer and Tom McGee.
You may not know this. You may not know this, but it's the doubled over, wailing, thrown to the ground, gulping for air grief that will finally save you, my friend. From down here, you can feel the worms and the mud and the blood of the way things are. Like the donkey that was eaten by coyotes last night. It's the way things are. So when you finally turn and look into the face of death, you can see that the eye of the donkey is the eye of the Christ. And all at once you fall into that eye, and the world you thought you knew begins to explode apart. And the horror and the mercy and the smell and the feel of life and death and birth and the donkey's breath and the red poppies from beneath your feet make you smile and cry and laugh and cry some more. Suddenly you realize that life is more than manicured lawns and stoplights. It's this unraveling divine upheaval. See? It's this crazy, wicked joy, apparently. It's the way things are. It's the way things are. I love to have accompaniment with my poetry. It's nice.
I'll pick better music next time.
Please. It actually worked. It was just chaotic enough. Now we're in the big city. We're not in the canyon anymore. Welcome, everybody. I start off with poetry just to keep you a little off balance. Like, what the hell is he doing? Did it work? Okay, good. So welcome to this beautiful and difficult subject of living with loss and moving toward acceptance. The operative phrase there is moving toward, because Tom and I are not arrogant enough to think that we're going to come up with answers about how to live with loss. It's a process, and I like to say it's harrowing and it's holy at the same time. And so, thank you for being courageous enough to enter a subject like this, because I'm not going to make balloon animals, and we're not going to have, it's not a cheery subject. And yet, strangely, in the depths of despair, when grief is having her way with me, and I say her because with my grief, I'm getting closer and closer to the earth, and it has a feminine Mother Earth voice for me. The closer I get to her, there's a strange aliveness. There's an unspeakable grace that's emerging. And part of the reason why Tom and I do these talks is not just to promote our retreat that's coming up, but we want to have a conversation with all of you about where this subject lands inside of you and what gets touched. And so when we complete, we take a little break, and then we want you all to stay and come back, because we want to hear what's going on inside of you. This is not a monologue. This is a beginning of a conversation. So what I noticed about this subject for me, because I've really been in the trenches myself, and it's like, how am I going to talk about something that's so difficult to talk about? And I thought, well, that's exactly why I need to find my way through this subject. And so I was looking at the title, Living with Loss and Moving Toward Acceptance, and I realized that there's a space between those, and that space, that territory, I believe, is the grief work. Because we can't get to anything that remotely smells like acceptance without the grief work. And I say that with all humility. I think that grief work and soul work are synonymous. And so if I have an intention today, it's about reimagining our relationship with grief. And what I mean by that is, let's make it sacred again, okay? Let's make grief sacred again. She's been shackled in the basement long enough. We need to hear those cries and those wails. And we cannot, even though I know there's I think a 5-step process for grief, and that first one is denial. You know, denial works temporarily when you're in your teens and 20s. But when you're in the middle of your life, or as they say on the back nine, denial doesn't work anymore. Anybody having success with that one? Because I don't. So the only thing that seems to remotely work is to lean towards it. And not alone, but with help. So, where to begin with this subject? Well, if grief is the the animal that we're wanting to get closer to. And get friendlier to and make sacred again. Then I'm hearing all these different voices, and I think of the Sufis that say, oh, break my heart, life. Oh, break my heart again. Oh, break it again. Oh, break it one more time. Yeah, and break it even again so I can learn how to love. So that's what we're up to, something like that. So I don't know if the rest of you have experienced this, but there seems to be a very strange intimacy and a sacred exchange between what feels unbearably sad and at the same time this exquisite aliveness that puts you closer to everybody and everything in the world. And I'm not saying I live there, but I have moments of it. Anybody else know what I'm talking about? Yeah, there's these moments, and I think it might be great. I don't know what it is. So, Tom and I don't bring answers today, but we bring tremendous reverence and a longing to bring this subject into the town square where it belongs. You know, grief rituals go back tens of thousands of years. Some people think it was the very first ritual, and I don't doubt it. And we'll talk more about that a little later. But I want to talk about what happens when the heart breaks. There's not too many places we can talk about the heart breaking. And if you're paying attention at all, it's going to break a number of times in your lifetime. It's not about avoiding that. It's what do we do when the heart breaks? One of my teachers that wrote this fabulous book I couldn't recommend enough, teacher, brother Francis Weller, wrote a book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. Completely experiential. It's not abstract at all. He said that when the heart breaks, it opens us into a wider range of self. And it's actually selves, plural. And what he means by that is something I'm going to share with you that has radically changed my life. He said that when we're born as an individual soul, this is an ancient belief, so try it on. When we're born as an individual soul, we're born into the soul of a family to protect and bless us. Okay? So there's already two selves, souls, intermingling. And the family soul is protected and blessed by the village soul. Now we're talking about an ideal world. But this world actually exists in some indigenous tribal communities still. So we got the individual soul born into a family soul, protected and blessed by the village soul, and the village soul is protected and blessed by the natural world soul, and the natural world soul is protected and blessed by the cosmic soul. There's 5 interweaving selves. What if that's our true nature? What if that's our true nature? And I think it is. And I'm not here to proselytize, but I am the one talking right now, so you get to listen to what I have to say. You can disagree. I hope we get to hear how you really feel. But this has been radically important to me, because when my heart breaks, I'm not just an individual self that's condemned to my isolation. It actually opens me into the awareness and the felt experience of the family soul. and the village soul, and the natural world soul, and the cosmic soul. And imagine them interweaving and dancing. You'd have a hard time being alone or lonely if you have those five going on, huh? There's a good problem to have. I can't find my way to breakfast because I've got these five interweaving souls and they're all around me. So I believe that grief shears us and prunes us down to what's most essential. And I don't want to speak like this is some kind of abstract lecture. I would also like to say that life has been kicking my ass pretty good. And so in the last 9 months, I'm going through divorce. My mother just died 3 weeks ago, and I'm just recovering from a respiratory infection in my lungs. And I'm not a victim, but man, it's been tough. It's been tough. And I've been in a lot of grief, but you know what? I'm not alone. I'm in 4 circles a week. I'm really stubborn about that. I don't do it alone. So if I tried to isolate, my brothers and my sisters would say, Richard, what the hell's up with you? You look like you're isolating. Don't do that. And they would remind me about my 5 interweaving selves. And they do. This man does. This man does. I got a lot of, this sister does. It's like a spiritual insurance policy where I can't get too far away. My mentor used to call it kicking my butt back into the sacred circle. So, what if that's true, that you have that large of an inheritance of identity? We're talking about expanding your identity. And what if it's true that when grief shears you down, prunes you down, and you feel like a featherless bird that's been molted, what if you then get to feel those other dimensions of identity? So I'd like to say something about grief rituals. I've been really blessed to have apprenticed with the West African shaman Maladamba Somé and his partner Francis about 20 years ago, and I got introduced to grief rituals. And the first one I went to, there were all these people wailing and crying, and it's like, you know, my conditioned Western consciousness was like, what is their problem? I'm the one that had the problem, because my Western consciousness had been so conditioned to privatize pain and suffering that grief was never shared in public. And we're really messed up that way as a culture. We're actually grief phobic. We're death phobic and we're grief phobic. And so going to a grief ritual, I mean, you know, I'm a counselor, I believe in therapy, but therapy's been around for about 120 years? And these rituals have been around for a few 100,000 years. Which one do you trust more? And I like therapy, but therapy is a beginning that opens you into this bigger village. And I may be sounding radical when I say this, but hopefully I do. A good grief ritual is worth about 2 or 3 years of therapy. Therapists don't like it when I say that, but the therapists that have been to a grief ritual know exactly what I'm talking about. So grief rituals, we sing for about 3 hours, sometimes 2, sometimes 4, somewhere around 3, and we drum, and we have a grief shrine, and you go as many times as you want. But here's the key, is you have support, because for grief to be activated, there has to be holding and there has to be release. And in our culture, because we don't have people supporting us, which one do you think wins? Well, of course, it's holding. So we hold our grief, and then we can't release it. So we need other people to hold it for us and with us. Tom and I are going to be leading a grief ritual sometime in September. I'd love to have all of you there. One of the reasons we don't like, well, the word grief scares the hell out of most people, and then you add the word ritual, and it's like, holy, what are these people doing? The way I was taught was for a ritual to be really effective, when you leave, you're changed from the way you went in. The persona cracks and you become temporarily deranged. We don't like that word, deranged. I'm feeling very deranged these last 9 months. Anybody feel a little derangement in their life lately? Oh, yeah. Thank you. That helps to not feel alone. Then you take into consideration the culture we live in. There's some madness out there, huh? Some fear, some hatred. And so we need grief rituals more than ever. But in order for grief to feel like it can be released, I told you there's got to be holding, but there also has to be a climate of warm-heartedness. There will never be grief released in a climate of analysis or cold-heartedness. And it helps to be outside in the wild. Screech owl flying by. The smell of a damp bog. And the singing. See, it's in our bones. It's in our bones. We know how to release this as a people. We've just forgotten. What Francis says in his book is that we're a culture that suffers from amnesia and anesthesia. So we've forgotten. We have to remember that grief has always been in creative tension with gratitude. We call these two the great arms of life, grief and gratitude. And they're always in a creative tension with each other. So let's make grief sacred again. And I know this is the beginning, talking about it, but we need to have this conversation. Right? So the only way I can stay authentic with myself and deliver such a difficult subject is a call and a response. And the call is going to be from the places where we cling and control and don't let go, we grasp. And the response is going to be through poetry. Because that's the voice of the soul. And that's the most meaningful speech I know. Because it carries images and feelings and the elements. And you can't quite figure poetry out, but you can feel it. So that's what I'm going to bring today. Living with loss and moving toward acceptance. Grief work. What's your relationship with grief? What's your family's relationship with it? Does anybody ever talk about it? Can you cry in front of your family? See, it's not really grief unless you get a little ugly. You got to like pull your hair out a little bit. You got to scratch. But in America, being rugged individualists, we like to do everything that is effective. And we take a weekend workshop on grief. Then we're done with it. We go back to our 12-hour-a-day job. And I'm not suggesting that. This takes a long time. The 9 months of grief I've been in is just the beginning. It's just the beginning. It's going to take years, I know that. Anybody lost their parents or family member or somebody you love? Yeah, it takes a while, doesn't it? So I want to introduce the 5 gates of grief. And then we're going to bring in some poetry and we're going to have some fun. Huh? Yes, fun. 5 gates of grief have really helped me look at grief because most of us are conditioned to look at grief only through the first gate, which is personal loss. And that's the one that most dramatically hits us through death, divorce, a breakup with a sweetheart, moving, illness, loss of dreams. These are all personal losses, and they're devastating. And they take the breath right out of us, and they throw us to the ground. You know what's strange about grief is when somebody sits in the counseling room with me, they apologize for having it. What the hell is going on with us? Why would we apologize for something that is so primal? So let's stop apologizing for our grief. And when somebody says, well, what's wrong with you? I say, I'm in a lot of grief. Bucko, how come you aren't? You paying attention? So the first gate is personal loss. We all know about that. And it's devastating. The other 4 gates are more impersonal, but they can be just as devastating on another level. They kind of go underneath consciousness. One of the things we need to do with our grief work is we need to take it from behind us, that this energy that's pulling us down and backward, and we need to, what we say a lot in our men's work is we keep it out in front of you. Keep it out in front of you. So name it. What is that thing that you're just so heartbroken about? Name it. Put it out in front of you so we can all hold it with you. Okay? The second gate. Well, the first gate, let me give you the name of it. The first gate is everything and everyone that we love, we will lose. That's ominous. And it's the darn truth. Everything and everyone you love, you will lose. We will lose, including yourself. So before we go on to the second gate, there's a poem. It's time for a poem, don't you think? Yeah. 12th century poem. Emmanuel of Rome. 'Tis a fearful thing to touch. I'm sorry, let me start over. 'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch. 'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch. To love, to hope, to dream, and oh, to lose. A thing for fools, this love. For your life once lived in me, your laugh once lifted me. Your word was a gift to me. To remember this brings painful joy. 'Tis a fearful thing and a human thing to love, and a holy thing to love what death can touch. That's the first gate. That's the first gate of grief. The second gate. I heard about these other gates. It was so liberating to me because sometimes in our lives there's like these low-level griefs that we can't quite name. We don't know what the heck it is, but it's there. And the second gate is all the places inside of you that have not been touched by love. all the places that have not known love. And in our men's work, Tom and I call this the outcast brothers and the outcast sisters. The outcast brothers and outcast sisters are in exile, and they have not been welcomed by a warm heart or a loving touch. And so they stay exiled. Things like fear and anger, and especially the shame boy and the shame girl. Because when we have wounds that don't get tended to, after years and years, they get wrapped in shame. And here's the weird thing about shame. We cannot grieve for places that put us outside the circle of worth. And when we feel shame, we feel unworthy of being loved. So we can't grieve for these places that feel unworthy. So it feels like it's impossible to cry for something where I don't feel worthy enough to cry for. But there is a way out. There is a way out. The shame boy and the shame girl still needs our warm heart, and it still needs the kind touch. And here's what we've learned. This is worth writing down. These 3 movements of shame. The first one is we have to move from worthlessness to woundedness. Do you feel the difference? That's a huge difference. If I see this shame boy as wounded but not worthless, maybe, just maybe, I can love him and maybe he can receive that love. The second one is I have to shift from having contempt for this shame boy, this shame girl, and I need to shift to compassion. So from contempt to compassion. And the last one is from silence to sharing. You do those 3 and you're on your way to healing this shame inside. And it takes a while. But this is one of the most beautiful things that Tom and I see in our circles is men beginning to share not just their wounds, but the places where they feel shame. Because see, shame doesn't want anybody to see it. So we cultivate strategic personalities to keep people back. Like being a super intellect or super funny or a workaholic or whatever, just stay back. Don't look at my shame. Okay? But men that begin to feel safer with each other, and when I say men, I mean women. I just happen to work with men a lot. Okay? I'm really happy that you women are here. By the way, you're the best disseminators of this knowledge. Men are not as good about putting the word out. You guys are. Thank you. Without the feminine, I'd be totally messed up. I got a sister that brought lemons and all kinds of stuff down for my cough. Thank you, Linda. So, the second gate, all the places that have not been touched by love, we need to begin to name them, and we need to begin to move towards them with mercy and kindness, even if we don't know how to do it. I hear people say a lot, but I don't know how to love this part. He looks like Gollum. How do you love Gollum? Slowly. Remember, Gollum used to be a hobbit, right? Then he went underground. Just like us. Just like us. Third gate, the sorrows of the world. This one's not too hard to feel either. Every day we're losing species, we're losing habitats, we're losing cultures, we're losing languages at a rate we can't even fathom. Clear cuts, I mean, it's devastating, but we have to look at it. We have to talk about it. We have to grieve it. Denial doesn't work. We can't pretend it's not happening. So our mother is screaming. She's been ravaged. She's in tremendous pain, and we need to attend to her. I'm thinking of this phrase of the Irish poet John O'Donohue, who talks about the reverence of approach. We can't really move towards grief unless we have this reverence of approach. I love that. I think reverence is a word we need to bring back into our vernacular. It's been lost, we need to bring it back. And O'Donohue says that when we approach something like grief with reverence, then the grief decides to approach us with something really large. But not until we make that movement with reverence. So the reverence of approach. Sorrows of the world is the third gateway. All these things go into our body soul, whether we're aware of it or not. It becomes normalized. And that addiction to anesthesia where we numb out, we don't feel it, but it's penetrating us all the time. The fourth gate of grief is expecting something we didn't receive. This one really brings me to my knees because I'm such a lover of community and village, and thank you for being a community today. When we were born, we expected to have aunts and uncles and grandmothers and grandfathers singing our name all night long, singing and dancing and celebrating and calling our soul into the world, into the mountains, into the night sky. And we didn't get that. We didn't get that. We're lucky if we got one or two pairs of eyes in an antiseptic, fluorescently lit room. And so that appointment with the village got disappointed. And that's a grief. Just the fourth gate of grief. Man, I'm feeling really sad. Anybody else? That's a good thing, because this is legitimate sadness. We don't usually talk about this, do we? We're talking about it. That's the fourth gate, expecting something we didn't receive. And this is that kind of expectation that's in your bones. Anybody feel that? You expected a village? One of the saddest things is we're so far removed from a village or community that many of us don't even feel like that's a loss. But I'm telling you, it is. The fifth gate is the ancestral gate to grief. And this one has a couple of qualities. The first one is the wounds that they gave us, that we inherited from our fathers, and our mothers, all the way back through alcoholism and neglect and abuse. And some of that grief is that we're all immigrants. And when our family immigrated here, they didn't get welcomed. And so they never really assimilated. And so they felt like refugees. And so this gate of expecting something we didn't receive, another way to say that is longing for belonging. This is the gate of the grief of longing for belonging. And that belonging wound is a deep one. Boy, I feel it so much every day. But David White has this wonderful way of saying that even in our exile, when we feel most horrifically exiled and where we just feel like we don't belong anywhere, as soon as we name it and say it, he says we're already halfway home. But we're naming it. We're putting it in the room. Because we all want to come home, huh? We all want to come home. So those are the 5 gates of grief. There's more. I'll stop there. Another one would be trauma. We haven't cultivated that one yet. Maybe that's the 6th gate. So, anybody feel the gravitas of this subject? The word grief comes from gravis, which is the same words that make gravity and gravitas, grave. It's heavy. It means heavy. ways you know when you're around an initiated man or initiated woman is they have substance. They don't float above the ground like some people in Ojai do. I love Ojai, but we need a little more substance there, a little more grief work. I pick on Ojai, and I love it, and I live there, but it's the same way everywhere. We're just more special about it. So, gravitas. One of my favorite words is ballast. Anybody know what ballast means? It's what keeps a ship from tipping over. It's the weightedness at the bottom of a ship. And when you do grief work, which is soul work, you start to cultivate ballast. It's not like you can go buy it at Ace or something, but I wish we could. But ballast starts to develop in a man or a woman when you start to bring reverence to your grief work. And you can feel the difference in a brother or a sister that has some of that. Okay, we're going to segue now, and I want to bring in the 4 archetypes that all indigenous cultures have agreed on are the 4 most common archetypes. And the reason I want to bring these in is that underneath every archetype is a shadow side where we're addicted to some kind of negative, Jung would call it a complex, where we are controlling, we're either addicted to having to know things, and it keeps us from letting go and opening into the fullness of life and doing this grief work. And so I want to name these 4 archetypes and the shadow sides and where we're addicted. And I'm going to bring in a poem to counter each one. So it follows the medicine wheel. So we'll start in the east. And the person that wrote this book, Tom and I have done this work. Angeles Arian's her name, The Fourfold Path. He said that when 85% of indigenous cultures are in agreement, it becomes a universal archetype. So in the east, it's the visionary. And the visionary is all about creative imagination. And the way you activate creative imagination through the archetype of the visionary is through singing. Isn't that interesting? Singing. We need a lot more creative imagination in our current culture, don't we? O'Donoghue always said, go bigger with your imagination when you get stuck, when you're in a conflict. Always go bigger with your imagination. So the shadow side of the visionary with creative imagination is the addiction to what's not working. Damn, it just won't ever rain again. It's never going to rain. And then when it rains, it's never going to stop raining. You know, the line at the bank is always so long. I'm so sick of eating turkey. This negative rant, you know, and there's a fine line. We need to share about what's bothering us. But I'm talking about the addiction to what's not working as an addiction. And we've all been around these people, and some of us are these people. I've been this person. Say, so are you sick of my negative rant? If they don't say anything, I'll just continue. Because it's not enough for me to feel really bad about my life. I want you to feel bad about my life. All right. So, it's crazy, isn't it? So this is the shadow side to the archetype of the visionary. And I have a poem that is like the call and response to this place that nothing is working and nothing ever will work. These days, darkness descends like one of those Alaskan storms that move in until all the light is squeezed out for the long, interminable winter. These days, if a man cannot feel the gravity of grief that screams from the earth, then he cannot be trusted with humans, animals, or trees. These days, my brothers, it is time to fall to our knees with the weight of this living. Kiss the sacred earth again, pray for forgiveness, with eyes open and flowing with the river of tears that yearn to soften and free us and bless us back into living again. Yes, it is time to grow the kinds of men whose hearts would gladly sit up all night with their sick child. That man weeps for all the losses and all the violence that cut like a knife to the soul. That man easily weeps for feeling the moon glimmering round from behind the storm. Let's walk on the medicine wheel to the south. It's the archetype of the healer. The archetype of the healer is all about love, and it's activated through storytelling. The shadow side of the archetype of the healer is the addiction to intensity, which Angeles Arian said, all addictions are about the addiction to intensity. I think she's right. I would also add the word drama. The addiction to intensity and drama, frenzy, being frenetic. All we got to do is look around in our current culture, huh? We're going way too fast, way too fast. It's an addiction. Hard to grieve when you're running that fast, huh? Not only hard, it's impossible. Moving target. Nobody can hold me when I'm on the run like that. Talking fast, eating fast, driving fast. There's no presence. So the addiction to intensity and drama. When I was working with Malidoma, he said that whatever you give your attention to during the day, you take on that rhythm. So if it's trees, you take on the rhythm of trees. If it's machines, you take on the rhythm of the machines. And we live in a machine culture. That's one of the challenges we're up against, is how to unplug from the machine world once in a while to remember that the soul's rhythm is actually very slow, like a stone. So this frenetic, insanely fast, out of our body, disassociated, ungrounded, it's a crazy place. So the poem that came through for me in response to this crazy addiction to intensity came through a dream. And the dream was an old witch that visited me in an oak forest. And I listened to her, and this is what happened. She is older than the red leaves in the acorn-crumbled earth. Slowly, slowly, she turns toward me and begins to speak with the ancient tongue of trees. You have been dreamed here, she says, you have been dreamed here. For the hearts of men have grown cold and can no longer feel the moan inside of things. So I will teach you how to listen, how to kiss the ache inside of loneliness. But first you must lie upon the mother's body and listen to her red-boned cries. Then, when her cries have become your own, get up, walk back to town, and tell your brothers what it means to be a man, what it means to hold and care for the shy and tender children of the earth. We keep walking around the medicine wheel, and we get to the West. And in the West is the archetype of the teacher. And the archetype of the teacher is about wisdom. And the way the archetype of the teacher's wisdom is activated is through silence, the sweet territory of silence. We don't have much about silence these days. It's such a beautiful thing when it gets quiet, isn't it? But if we're not used to quiet, it can make us a little anxious. What's going to happen? So I invite you to explore the sweet territory of silence. So, that's the gift of the teacher, the archetype of the teacher. Wisdom through silence. The shadow side is the addiction. Man, and this one's a real doozy. It's the addiction to having to know. I just heard a few groans. I guess I'm not the only one that has this one, huh? The addiction to having to know. Just look at our addiction to the internet, and it's not enough to research something. We need to research it for like 7 or 8 hours because more information's better. Better for who? Well, I got a truckload of information on this subject, and now I'm going to go to bed and I'm trashed. We laugh, but I mean, it's kind of funny, but it's insane. It's insane. So, the addiction to having to know. I have a memory of being 29, 30. I was in therapy for the first time because I had to be. I didn't want to go, but it's one of those programs where you have to go to therapy. Oh, God, okay. So about 6 months in, she asked me a question, and I said, I don't know. And she said, oh, my God, Richard doesn't know something. She said, we should have a holiday. I didn't like her. But she was right. She was right. I was addicted to having to know things. So I invite all of you this week to consciously say, I don't know, and see how that feels. It's like we've become, we've become disengaged from those 3 words. What will they think of me if I don't know? There's nothing more tedious, I'm sorry, but this is where my sexism comes in, than a man that knows everything. We get one of these in the men's circle once in a while. And say, please don't come back. You know everything. There's no room for the soul to enter when we know everything. So, here's the poem that comes through me in response to this know-it-all addiction, to this very, very beautiful, silence-drenched archetype of the teacher. I want to feel the place in me that loves. I want to feel the place in me that loves. Beneath strategies of success, beneath certainties, I want to feel the place in me that slowly unravels like that favorite old sweater coming apart at the throat and under the arms. I am so weary of being tightly stitched, intact, impervious. I want you to hold my face and kiss my eyes while I slowly come apart, thread by thread by thread. Something like that. Okay, as we keep walking to the north, it's the archetype of the warrior, which actually, if we go back farther to the Paleolithic, it was the archetype of the hunter. But for the sake of the popular culture, we'll call it the warrior. But it's the same primal energy. And the archetype of the warrior is all about power. But power is a tricky one because in our cultural conditioning, some have power and some don't. And that's all made up. There's a winner, there's a loser. That's all made up. Because real sacred power is what ensues from being in relationship. Like right now, we have sacred power in the room. Who's doing it? Well, we're all doing it. So real power comes from being relational. But the way we've been taught about power is it's one up or one down, it's winner, it's loser. And that kind of power, which isn't really power, it's tyranny. It's tyranny and it's oppression. But you can be just as addicted to the underdog as you are the overdog, if that's a word. Oh, sure, go ahead, go ahead. Tell me what to do. I've never thought of that before. I'm just a little mouse. That's just as sickening as somebody that's bossing all the time. So what we're looking for is that healthy assertion, that healthy relationship with power. And by the way, that one up and one down is the hallmark of what Tom and I have learned to call pathological adolescence. It's grotesque. Only an adolescent fixated around the age of 14 or 15 would be so obsessed with having power over or under. There's no partnership. So the shadow side to the archetype of the warrior power is addiction to perfectionism. And it's interesting that to activate the real power from being in relationship, sacred power, is activated through dancing. Dancing activates it. Look it up, research it. It's true. It's true. I would also add some subgroups to the addiction to perfectionism. I like the addiction to being a bully, the addiction to tyranny, or the other side, the addiction to giving my life away because you know better than I do. What do you think? How do I feel? I mean, that codependent, syrupy, yucky place. So the poem that comes in response to this archetype of the warrior, which is all about sacred power, it's not in response to that, it's in response to the addiction to perfectionism and tyranny. The poem that came through for me comes from my Grandpa Charlie. And, Grandpa Charlie. Well, you'll find out in the poem, won't you? He said this one thing all the time. Bless your heart. He said, oh, bless your heart. Growing up with a fairly violent father, that was kind of odd to me. I'd tell him how my day was, and he'd say, oh, bless your heart. And he meant it. Oh, bless your heart, he always said. Oh, bless your heart. Grandpa Charlie was a love man, a blessing man. He was the only man I ever saw cry for beauty, for hummingbirds and earthworms and round ripe figs and sycamore leaves and strangers on the street. I called him my king of kindness. He had no horns of defense, no strategies for victory. He was a love man, A blessing man. And a blessing man changes the world. I'm going to say that again. And a blessing man changes the world by pouring outward his honey of kindness. Oh, bless your heart. So those are the four archetypes and the shadows and my zany response through poetry. Now I'm going to leave you with one last poem. It's actually not a poem. It's an excerpt from a letter by Rainer Maria Rilke, who I think might be the greatest poet of the soul that ever lived. This is from a book called Letters to a Young Poet, 1903. And I love this so much, I made copies. Some of you have in front of you. It's back here if you didn't get one. I love this so much, I'm going to put it up on the wall, and I invite you to do the same and read it for a while. I think Rilke really got it when he talks about ripening. That's a word we don't hear too much unless I guess you're a farmer or a poet. Rilke, as a boy, was forced to dress up like a girl because his mother wanted a girl. Now, if he wanted to do that, that'd be a different thing, but he didn't want to do that. He did it because she'd make him go outside and knock on the door, and she'd say, "Who's there?" And he had to say, "It's Maria." So that kind of messed with him. By the time he was 10, the father was sick of that, and so he sent him to military school. I'm sure that really fixed that problem. So I've shared with some of the men, this reminds me of this anonymous poetic quote that goes, "Death, insanity, or become a poet." So that's what he did. That's what he did. So here's the words he shared. And then Tom's gonna say a few things, and then we're gonna take a break, and I'd really like you all to come back. We're gonna give Rilke the last word, at least for this moment. Rilke said, "Do not measure in terms of time. 1 year, 10 years mean nothing. For the artist, there is no counting or tallying up, just ripening. Just ripening. Like the tree that does not force its sap and endures the storms of spring without fearing that summer will not come. But it will come. It will come, however, only to the patient ones. Only to the patient ones who stand there as if all eternity lay before them. Vast, still, untroubled. I learn this every day of my life. I learn this from the hardships I am grateful for. Patience is all. Thank you. Thank you.